Hi guy, welcome back TV spoilers. Young and the Restless contained that Mariah stepped out of the mental health facility like someone who had escaped a sealed room but still carried its echo inside her skull. The air outside should have made breathing easier, yet it felt like another doorway into the same maze. She hadn't left to run from treatment, not exactly. She had left because she believed she needed space to handle what was hers alone, away from disinfectant, repeating sessions, and questions that forced her to name her fear out loud. But the moment her feet touched ordinary life again, guilt tightened around her like an invisible cord. In Mariah's mind, Ian's death wasn't simply an ending, it was a gigantic question mark. A relentless knock against her ribs every time she tried to believe she was safe. She thought he was dead, and that belief itself became the crack where her conscience leaked through drop by drop, cold, stubborn and unending. The horror of it was that Mariah didn't need anyone to say Ian's name, didn't need a fresh rumor to collapse. Ian arrived in the blank space between two breaths, in the silence of a room, in the sound of a car door shutting, in the most ordinary moments that should have meant nothing at all. Rationally, she knew these were images her imagination built, a byproduct of trauma and an obsession that hadn't released its grip. But Mariah's logic was no longer a sturdy wall, it was a thin pane of glass. And every time Ian returned, that glass trembled like it was about to shatter. Those images weren't merely a face appearing at the edge of her vision. They carried judgment, pursuit, the sensation of being dragged back to the instant when everything slipped beyond her control. She could close her eyes, cover her ears, tell herself it was only a hallucination. But the pain was real, the bodily panic was real. And the ice crawling up her spine whenever she felt Ian standing behind her was as real as any wound. The more Mariah tried to handle it alone, the deeper she sank into self-punishment. There were moments when she convinced herself she was managing, that she was strong enough to keep moving, clear-headed enough to separate what was real from what was not. And then, with one brief lapse of focus, everything dropped like an elevator with a snapped cable. Ian came back, sneering at her effort, and Mariah drowned in the terror that his death had never truly ended inside her. That single event became spilled ink, bleeding into every relationship, every decision, every future she had ever tried to hold steady. Mariah didn't only fear Ian, she feared herself. Feared that something deep inside her had been warped by what she lived through, and feared she would hurt the people she loved in ways she could no longer prevent. On the other side of town, Abby felt Ian's return like a nightmare relapse, even if no one could see it with their own eyes. For Abby, Ian wasn't just a name or a bad memory. He was the embodiment of darkness that once seeped into her life, and left scars that refused to close. That terror didn't require proof to exist, because it had already been carved into her survival instincts, hypervigilance, flinching at tiny details, the sense that everything could be destroyed in a single night. Abby wasn't only afraid for herself, she was afraid for Mariah. Afraid of how fragile Mariah's line between recovery and collapse had become. And that fear grew heavier when Abby understood something cruelly simple. Ian didn't have to actually appear. If Mariah believed he was there, it would be enough to make the damage real. Meanwhile, another shift was quietly happening around Tessa. Tessa wasn't a betrayer by nature, but she had been living inside an emotional vacuum for too long. She had tried to stay in the role of patience, to be the steady one, to believe love could wait for healing. But people don't survive on faith alone, they survive on being touched by reality, on feeling seen and understood right now, in the present. Daniel stepped into that empty space not as a calculated predator, but as a natural pull and accidental shelter where Tessa could breathe, without forcing herself to be strong every second. At first she could tell herself it was only a weak moment, only a need for someone to help her stand upright. Yet the harder she denied it, the more she recognized the truth. Her feelings had taken shape, and they were no longer simple friendship or sympathy. She couldn't resist Daniel, and that realization landed like a slap with shock, cold with guilt. The passionate kiss Daniel and Tessa shared wasn't merely an impulsive act. It was proof a door had opened that would be hard to close again. After it happened, Tessa could no longer pretend everything was still contained. She felt the eruption of emotion she had been clamping down for months. And she felt the danger of taking even one step further. The tension wasn't only desire. It was consequence waiting at the end of the road. Mariah was at her most fragile. Abby was being haunted by Ian's shadow. And Tessa was standing in front of a choice where every outcome could break someone's heart. If Daniel and Tessa chose to go farther, That moment would not only carry heat and longing, it would mark a slide. A decision to soothe themselves in a way that could create a new wound. Daniel, for all his own confusion, wasn't blind to what this was doing to her. He knew Tessa was being pulled between need and responsibility. Knew she was judging herself before anyone else had the chance. That was why his promise to her wasn't a casual line meant to soften the moment. It was a rope thrown into a whirlpool, a vow that he would not abandon her when things turned ugly. He promised he would be there, that he would face the fallout with her, that he would not leave her alone to carry the consequences. But even a promise can become another weight if the storm ahead is too large. And Daniel understood that the path they had stepped onto was no longer just about the two of them. It would reach Mariah. It would reach Abby. It would hit every existing fracture and make it shake. Back with Mariah. The cruelest part was that she understood exactly what was happening. Ian existed only in her imagination. Sometimes she could even see how irrational it was. Could almost laugh bitterly at the idea of her own mind turning against her. But pain doesn't need logic to destroy. Ian's images didn't become gentler because they weren't real, if anything. They grew more terrifying because they couldn't be arrested, couldn't be proven wrong, couldn't be erased by an investigation or a definitive answer. Mariah was being tortured by something without a fixed shape. Something that vanished when she wasn't alone and returned the second the room emptied out. And that solitude sometimes only minutes long was enough to let Ian inside her head swell into a bottomless monster. The thread connecting all of this was brutally simple. When one person is trying to recover, every tremor around them becomes twice as dangerous. Mariah left the facility to confront her own demons. Abby was sinking into an old terror as if Ian had risen again. And Tessa was sliding into new feelings with Daniel like a natural reaction to prolonged exhaustion. None of them set out to destroy anything. Yet the fragility of this moment made every choice sharp as a blade. And when Ian returned to haunt Mariah only in imagination, perhaps his darkness still had the power to spread like smoke, seeping into every crack of trust, love, and the rare peace they had been trying to protect. Night fell and the world grew quiet in a way that felt suspicious. Mariah tried to tell herself she only needed one more day, one more effort, one more ounce of courage to get through. Abby tried to convince herself her fear was only reflex, that the present was safer than the past. Tessa tried to cling to Daniel's promise like an anchor, telling herself that real feelings didn't automatically make her a bad person, while still knowing those feelings could shatter someone else's life. And then, in that stillness when each of them thought they had regained a sliver of control, the obsession called Ian tightened another turn of the screw, as if waiting for the exact second to remind them that no one truly escapes what has already happened. That day didn't end with closure. It ended like a warning that the next step would cost more, because if Mariah saw Ian one more time, or if Tessa couldn't stop with Daniel, everything they were trying to hold together could collapse in a way none of them would be able to stop. Next week in Genoa City, Mariah and Tessa's story stops being a simple marriage strained by distance and pressure, and turns into the week's most explosive scandalone that detonates like fireworks in the dark, leaving everyone holding their breath because no one can tell what's real anymore and what has been twisted by trauma. It all begins with Mariah's strange silence after her trip to Europe. A silence that doesn't resemble peace but feels like a slab of ice pressed against her throat, turning every attempt to speak into a choke. She comes home with exhausted eyes and something heavy lodged in her chest. So heavy that she instinctively retreats from Tessa, as if one honest look from the woman she loves could shatter the fragile shell she's clinging to just to survive. People see Mariah spiral into sudden panic, lose control at small sounds, drift out of the present and snap back shaking, as if she's reliving a nightmare she can't fully wake up from. Tessa senses that change with the instincts of someone who has held Mariah's hand through her darkest days, but this time is different. This time Mariah isn't just sad or depleted. She's trapped inside an invisible prison where every explanation feels dangerous. She dodges Tessa's questions, dodges care, even dodges simple affection as if it might unleash the secret she's trying to bury. And that avoidance sets off a new wave of speculation, first in quiet conversations, then in the way people look at them like a couple standing on the edge of collapse. The scandal doesn't need evidence to spread. In a town like Genoa City, a visible fracture is all it takes for the community to invent its own narrative and let it travel faster than the truth ever could. What turns the atmosphere toxic is the way fractured pieces of Mariah's memory begin to break the surface in ways she can't control. In a haunting flashback, Mariah remembers herself pinning down an older man, a pillow forced over him not as a clean, coherent scene with a beginning and an end, but as a violent jolt. A strip of darkness ripped open inside her mind. That image leaves Mariah no longer certain of herself because she can't tell if it's real. If it's a nightmare or if it's a memory warped by trauma, by medication, by the extreme stress she endured in Europe. From there, a cruel question takes root and refuses to let go. Did she cause a death? Or did someone make her believe she did? And that is where the name Ian Ward becomes a blade driven into every attempt at recovery. If Ian is only a hallucination, then it means Mariah's wounds never truly healed. That she's still locked in fear and pursued even if the pursuer exists only in her imagination. But if Ian is Olivia somehow interfering from a safe distance within, the entire situation becomes horrifying in a different way. Mariah's European secret isn't a random accident at all, but a perfectly designed trap meant to crush her from the inside out. The terror of Ian has never been about simple jump scares. It's always been about turning a victim's mind into a battlefield, turning memory into a weapon, and turning love into the softest target to strike. Mariah begins to live like someone staring into a mirror, and wondering if the face looking back is really hers, or just a version reshaped by fear. While Mariah isolates herself as a form of self-defense, Tessa is pushed into the opposite spiral. The more she is shut out, the more she needs answers. The more she needs something solid to hold onto before she breaks under the weight of helplessness. Tessa isn't only aching because she misses Mariah. She's aching because she's being treated like a stranger inside her own marriage. She starts to realize that silence is no longer time to heal, it's a wall. And once that wall is up, everything Mariah offers every vague reassurance. Every half-truth loses gravity. Because Mariah isn't saying anything real enough for Tessa to cling to. Suspicion seeps in not because Tessa wants to betray her vows, but because a person left alone in the dark for too long will create noise, just to fill the emptiness, even if that noise becomes destruction. That is why the scandal in their relationship isn't just about a couple having problems. It becomes a chain reaction. The more Mariah panics, the deeper she retreats behind defenses, and the deeper she retreats, the more she resembles someone hiding guilt. The more Tessa tries to pull her back, the more she looks like someone desperately gripping something slipping through her fingers. And that desperation is easily twisted by outsiders into something uglier. People begin to stare and pry. Every time Mariah disappears, it gets inflated into proof. Every time Tessa's patience frays, it gets labeled as jealousy, instability, a marriage rotting in public. In Genoa, a city where reputation is currency, and secrets are weapons, and fracture is enough to make someone want to dig deeper, to turn it into an open wound. Mariah knows that, and the knowledge makes her even more afraid. She's terrified that if she speaks, Tessa will never look at her the same way again. She's terrified that if she stays silent, Tessa will leave. She's terrified that if she admits she doesn't even know what really happened in Europe, the world will decide the worst anyway. Every option comes with a price. And the greatest price is the slow self-destructs beginning to form. Sometimes Mariah tries to cling to logic, reminding herself that memory can be wrong, that trauma can manufacture false images, that medication can bend reality. But then she remembers the weight of the pillow in her hands, the terrifying silence that followed. The older man reduced to a faceless blur, and every argument melts like snow. If it was Ian, why is the face unclear? If it wasn't Ian, why does the fear wear his name? And if it's only PTSD, why does guilt feel so real she can barely breathe? That ambiguity becomes the most merciless prison of all. It doesn't give Mariah a chance to clear her name, because she doesn't know what she's supposed to be clearing. It also doesn't give her a chance to confess, because she can't tell if she would be confessing to a real crime or to a crime planted in her mind. In a world where Ian Ward could be a ghost or a living puppet master, the line between reality and illusion becomes thin as paper. A stray reminder, a coincidence, a fragment of information drifting into Mariah's orbit is enough to make her collapse, like a building rotted from within. So when the scandal continues to explode next week, the real highlight won't be a simple fight or a cold distance between Mariah and Tessa. The highlight will be the moment the truth begins to move beneath the mud. Mariah's memory fragments may surface more often, sharper, as if her own mind is forcing her to look straight at what she's been avoiding. Tessa, driven to her limit, may begin to connect the signs and realize this isn't only a marriage crisis, it's a psychological survival war. And just when they believe it can't get worse, the sensation of Ian returns like a blade slicing the air open, leaving the most terrifying question hanging. If Ian is only a hallucination, who chose this moment to tear Mariah's wounds wide again, and why? But if Ian is truly alive, then Mariah's European secret may be only the first step of something larger, something designed to make Mariah look guilty, even if she's the victim. What's coming next week isn't a storm aimed at a marriage. It's a storm aimed at Mariah's mind, and once the mind is under attack, everything else becomes nothing more than dominoes waiting to fall. On our YouTube channel, TV Spoilers. I'm always looking for content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series. From the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting insights. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.